It is Sunday night. The house is quiet. The work week looms. You are sitting in the faint glow of a single screen. Your phone. The banking app is open. You look at the number. Then you look at the calendar. You calculate the hours you worked, the projects you completed, the commutes you endured, the meetings you sat through. You tally the effort, the energy, the time. Then you look at the number again. The number in the app does not reflect the effort. It does not match the sacrifice. A quiet frustration begins to build. Not anger, something heavier, a sense of futility. You did everything you were told to do. You worked hard. You put in the hours. You tried to set some aside. Yet the needle barely moves. The number feels stagnant, glued to a baseline. It feels like you are running hard. But the scenery never changes. This feeling is not an illusion. It is a signal. It is a symptom of a deep paradox at the heart of building wealth. A paradox that conventional advice fails to name. The core paradox, the first $100,000, is a paradox. It requires the most work for the least visible result. The effort is brutally front-loaded. The rewards are painfully back-loaded. This violates our intuitive sense of fairness, our belief in a linear relationship between effort and outcome. We believe that if we work twice as hard, we should be twice as far. This is not the case. In the early stages of capital formation, there is a force at play, an unseen resistance that consumes your initial efforts. To understand this, we must stop thinking about finance and start thinking about physics, the physical metaphor. Imagine a rocket on a launch pad. To leave the planet, it must overcome the immense pull of gravity. In its first few minutes, the rocket burns more fuel than at any other point in its journey. It shakes violently. It strains against an incredible force. It gains altitude with agonizing slowness. For an observer on the ground, it seems to be barely moving. All that fire, all that energy is being used just to fight a force, pulling it back down to earth. This is financial gravity. It is the powerful, unseen force that holds you down at the beginning. It consumes your initial savings. It drains your momentum. It makes your hard work feel futile. Your first $100,000 is not about building a skyscraper. It is about achieving escape velocity. It is about burning enough fuel to finally break free from the pull. To escape this financial gravity, we must first map its forces. We must give them a name. We will dissect the three primary forces that create this downward pull. First, the break-even drag. Second, the phantom progress tax. And third, the decision fatigue fog. Only after understanding these antagonists can we implement the engineering schematic designed to overcome them, the momentum protocol. Let's begin. This is the most direct expression of financial gravity. It is the force that keeps you pinned to the surface. You feel it every month. A new project brings in extra income. You work overtime for a larger paycheck. You get a small cost of living adjustment. For a moment, you feel a lift, a sense of progress. Then the drag engages. The car needs a new set of tires. The rent on your apartment goes up. The price of groceries climbs again. The extra income is consumed, almost before it registers. Your financial altitude does not change. You are simply moving faster to stay in the same place. This is the break-even drag. It is the tendency for expenses to expand and consume any increase in income. This is not a personal failing. It is a structural dynamic. It is financial gravity at its strongest. From a biological perspective, this state of constant financial pressure triggers a scarcity mindset. It elevates cortisol levels. It forces the brain into short-term thinking. Your focus narrows to survival, to making it through the next week, the next month. Long-term planning feels impossible, an indulgence you cannot afford. The break-even drag ensures that your energy is spent on staying at zero. It is the launch pad clamps, holding your rocket down. Let's say you manage to fight the drag. You successfully create a small surplus. You put $1,000 aside, then $2,000. You feel a sense of achievement. You are finally gaining altitude. But then a year passes. You look at your savings. The number is the same, but its power has diminished. The cost of everything around you has quietly increased. The down payment you were saving for is now a larger number. The investment you wanted to make now costs more per share. Your progress feels illusory, like you are climbing a ladder that is slowly sinking into the ground. This is the phantom progress tax. It is the silent erosion of purchasing power caused by inflation. It is a tax you pay, not on your income, but on the money you hold still. Warren Buffett's public writings have consistently highlighted this reality. He refers to inflation as a massive corporate bond that society is forced to buy, a bond with no maturity date and a punishingly low interest rate. In the context of our metaphor, the phantom progress tax is financial gravity weakening your vessel. It is a slow leak in your fuel tank. You burn energy just to replace the power you are silently losing. This makes the initial ascent even more resource intensive. It is why simply saving cash is often not enough to escape the pull. The money you set aside must not only exist, it must be working. It must be generating its own thrust. Otherwise, you are being taxed. For the very act of trying to move forward, there is a third, more subtle force. It does not attack your income or devalue your savings directly. It attacks your most valuable asset, your cognitive energy. Think about your last week. How many small financial decisions did you make? Should I get the coffee? Is the generic brand okay? Can I afford to go out with friends? Should I take the toll road or sit in traffic? Which bill should I pay first? Each one of these is a calculation, a tiny expenditure of mental fuel. Individually, they are meaningless, but collectively they create a fog, a constant low-level hum of anxiety and mental arithmetic. This is the decision fatigue fog. It is the gradual depletion of your capacity to make wise, long-term choices. After making 100 small decisions, your ability to make the one big important decision is severely compromised. You become more likely to give in, to choose the easy path, to make an impulse purchase, just to quiet the noise in your head. Within our metaphor, the decision fatigue fog is financial gravity disrupting your navigation. The rocket is powerful, the fuel tank is full, but the guidance system is failing. You cannot steer effectively. When you are overwhelmed by static, Buffett's framework often emphasizes the power of simplification, of removing variables, of creating systems that reduce the need for constant decision-making. He built a multi-billion-dollar enterprise by focusing on a few high-quality decisions over many decades, not by micromanaging thousands of small ones. The decision fatigue fog ensures that your best thinking is wasted on trivial choices. It keeps you from aiming your efforts in the right direction. So we have the three antagonists: the break-even drag, pinning you to the ground; the phantom progress tax, leaking your fuel; the decision fatigue fog, jamming your navigation. Together they create the immense force of financial gravity. So, how do we escape? The solution, the momentum protocol. Buffett's documented philosophy is not just a diagnosis of the problem, it is an engineering schematic for the solution. It is a plan to build a vessel strong enough to break free. We call this the momentum protocol. It is a three-step sequence designed to systematically defeat the antagonists and achieve escape velocity. A rocket's engine does one thing: it generates more upward thrust than the downward pull of gravity. Your financial engine must do the same. The surplus engine is the gap between your income and your expenses. It is not about saving what is left. It is about architecting a surplus with deliberate, focused intensity. This involves a two-front approach. First, attacking the break-even drag by managing expenses with precision. This is not about deprivation. It is about awareness, about directing resources consciously. Second, it is about increasing thrust. This means focusing on your primary income. As Buffett has often stated, your greatest asset is yourself. Investing in your skills to increase your earning power is the most direct way to build a more powerful engine. The goal of step one is simple: to make the gap between what you earn and what you spend as wide as possible. This gap is your fuel. This step is designed to combat the decision fatigue fog you cannot win a battle against 1,000 small choices every day. So you must remove the choices. The automation shield is a system that makes your most important financial decisions, for you, on autopilot. The moment your income arrives, a predetermined portion of it is automatically transferred. It moves from your checking account. To separate savings and investment accounts, it happens before you see the money, before you can debate what to do with it. This act removes dozens of decisions from your cognitive plate. It transforms saving from a daily struggle, of willpower into a non-event. It is boring. It is clinical. It is effective. It aligns with Buffett's principle of creating systems that protect you from your own worst emotional impulses. The automation shield is your rocket's pre-programmed flight path. It locks you onto the correct trajectory, freeing up your mental energy to focus on building the engine. This is the final stage, the one that defeats the phantom progress tax and achieves escape velocity. The surplus fuel you have created and automatically routed cannot sit idle in a tank. It must be put to work. The compounding catalyst is the process of deploying your capital into productive assets that have the potential to generate their own growth. This is the core of Buffett's entire philosophy. It is the snowball concept. A small ball of snow rolled down a long hill gathers more snow and grows exponentially. Your initial investments are the small snowball. Time is the long hill. At first, the growth is imperceptible. Your first dollar earns a few cents. It feels meaningless. But the process has begun. Your capital is now generating its own thrust. Slowly, the growth from your assets begins to supplement the thrust from your own labor. The rocket is no longer fighting alone. Over a long period, the growth becomes self-sustaining. This is the moment of escape, the moment when the upward pull of your compounding assets finally and permanently overcomes the downward pull of financial gravity. The struggle lessens. The altitude begins to increase at an accelerating rate. The paradox is resolved. The brutal front-loaded work has finally paid off what it actually buys. Breaking free from financial gravity does not mean a life of luxury overnight. The outcome is quieter, more fundamental. It buys the absence of the Sunday night feeling. It buys the ability to look at your banking app and feel a sense of stability, not dread. It buys what Buffett calls refusal power, the power to say no. No to a job you dislike. No to a project that violates your principles. No to a demand that compromises your well-being. It buys a low cortisol life, the freedom from the constant hum of anxiety, the mental space to think beyond the next bill, the capacity to be present with your family. It buys resilience, the ability to absorb an unexpected shock, a medical bill, a job loss, without it causing a catastrophe. That is the realistic outcome, not a finish line of wealth, but a new baseline of quiet strength. The protocol seems simple on paper, a 3-step schematic, but understanding the engineering is not the same as a successful launch. Many who attempt this journey still fail to reach escape velocity. Their rockets fall back to Earth. Why? Because they are unprepared for the specific system failures that arise during the ascent. Buffett's framework is built on rationality, but human beings are not always rational. Therefore, a complete protocol must include an analysis of its most common failure points. Let's examine the 3 critical failures that sabotage the momentum protocol. Critical failure point 1, the One Day Fallacy. This failure occurs at the very first step, the surplus engine. The individual understands the need for a surplus. They agree with the logic. They intend to start. But not today. They will start one day, when things are less chaotic, after the next promotion, when the next debt is paid off, when the new year begins. This is the one-day fallacy. It is the belief that a future, more perfect moment to begin is better than the imperfect moment today. This is a failure of activation energy. A rocket on the launch pad requires an immense initial burst just to ignite its engines. The one-day fallacy is a refusal to press the ignition button. It is a form of rationalized procrastination. The mind creates logical-sounding reasons to justify inaction. But from a physics perspective, A stationary object has no momentum. Zero. The only way to build momentum is to introduce an initial velocity, no matter how small. The solution, from a systems perspective, is to ignore the scale of the action and focus only on the action itself. Do not try to build the perfect engine today. Simply create a surplus of $1, just one. Automate a single dollar to a savings account. The amount is irrelevant. The action is everything. That single action breaks the inertia. It introduces a non-zero velocity. It defeats the one-day fallacy. By making the first step too small to fail, the system is now in motion. It can be optimized later, but it must be activated now. This failure attacks the second step. The automation shield. The system is built. The shield is active. The surplus is being routed automatically. For months it works perfectly. Then a moment of temptation arrives. A new phone is released. A once-in-a-lifetime vacation deal appears. A status object becomes desirable. The automated savings account, once hidden, is now viewed as a resource, a fund to be tapped for a large purchase. The mind begins to justify a manual override. I have been so disciplined. I deserve this. I can turn the automation back on next month. This is the manual override temptation. It is the single greatest threat to the integrity of the protocol. It is the equivalent of an astronaut deciding mid-flight to manually redirect all engine fuel to the life support system for a temporary boost in cabin comfort. The immediate result is pleasant. The long-term result is catastrophic. The mission fails. Each time the shield is manually overridden, its psychological power is diminished. It ceases to be a non-negotiable law and becomes a mere suggestion. The defense against this failure is to rename the account. Do not label your investment account savings or investment fund. Give it a specific non-negotiable purpose. Label it financial gravity escape plan or momentum protocol do not touch. This acts as a cognitive barrier. It forces you to confront the true cost of a manual override. You are not just dipping into savings. You are actively sabotaging your own escape. This is the most subtle and dangerous failure. It occurs during the final step. The compounding catalyst. The engine is running. The shield is holding. The capital is deployed. The snowball is rolling. But it is rolling with agonizing slowness. The growth is invisible. The daily gains are measured in cents. This is where the impatience gravity takes hold. It is the psychological pain of seeing immense effort produce imperceptible initial results. It creates a powerful urge to interfere, to check on the process, to change the strategy, to chase a faster result. This is like digging up a newly planted seed every day to see if it is growing. The act of observing disrupts the process of growth. Warren Buffett has built a career on one principle. That directly counters this failure, a long-term time horizon. His famous quote, "Our favorite holding period is forever," is the ultimate antidote to the impatience gravity. He understands that the real power of the compounding engine is only unleashed over vast stretches of time. The defense here is systemic. Build a system that makes it difficult to check your progress frequently. Remove the investing app from your phone's home screen. Commit to reviewing your portfolio quarterly, not daily. You must trust the physics of the system. The snowball does not care if you watch it. It only cares about the length of the hill and the consistency of the snow. By anticipating these 3 points of failure, the one-day fallacy, the manual override temptation, and the impatience gravity, the integrity of the protocol is maintained. The engineering holds. The ascent continues. Which brings us to the true outcome. Imagine yourself at 80 years old. You are sitting in a comfortable chair, looking out a window. You are not thinking about money, because you do not have to. You are thinking back on your life, and you remember a specific Tuesday, decades ago. It was an unremarkable day, but on that day, you spent 20 minutes at your computer. You set up an automatic transfer, a small amount of money. It felt insignificant at the time. A tiny, almost pointless action. You did not feel like a genius. You did not feel like a future millionaire. You just felt like you were. Finally trying something different. You were engaging the protocol. Looking back from the age of 80, you realized that quiet, boring action was not insignificant at all. It was the first push. The ignition sequence, the moment your rocket finally began to fight back. It was the decision that compounded, not just into a healthy balance sheet, but into a life lived with fewer fears, a life with more options, a life of earned peace. If this framework provided value, consider subscribing for more analysis.